So when it comes to your ideal client profile, when what's determined to be qualified versus not qualified, get really, really clear on their geographic location, their company size by number of employees, and their industry where they're located in. And the more specific you have that plan in place to be, the easier it is for your sales leader, the easier it is for your marketing team, whoever is doing this, to build out a target account list of a defined list of anywhere from a few dozen to a few hundred, or perhaps even a few thousand companies that fit perfectly within that definition of qualified. They're in the right geographic region, they're the right company size in terms of number of employees, and they're in the right kind of industry that lines up really well with where you've been most successful, where you've been most profitable, where they've been happiest. I'm Joshua Feinberg from DCSMI, the Data Center Sales and Marketing Institute. We are all about elevating the role of sales, marketing, and go-to-market professionals in the growth of the data center industry. And you are watching our weekly live stream, the Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A show, where each week I tackle a handful of the biggest sales and marketing challenges that we're hearing about from all over the data center industry, regardless of whether you're an operator like in hyperscale, colocation, wholesale, edge, or modular, or perhaps you're from a technology or facilities company that sells to or partners with data centers, or maybe you're from a construction or real estate company or some kind of capital related company, private equity or venture capital, or perhaps you do something related to outsourced sales and marketing in and around the data center ecosystem. But either way, if you're all about improving your role, what your team does, what your company does in the data center ecosystem, you are in the right place. For sales professionals, marketing professionals, account managers, customer success managers, products, channel partnerships, and the executive sponsor, the person that brings it all together, that makes sure everyone is aligned and on the same page and collaborating well. Kind of like an orchestra conductor, bringing in the most important parts at the perfect right time. To make sure that you get notified about upcoming live educational events like this and other related resources, make sure you subscribe to our weekly email newsletter that comes to your inbox on Sundays. You can subscribe to the Data Center Sales and Marketing newsletter at www.dcsmi.com. If you're watching this on LinkedIn, you can make sure to hit the follow button. If you're watching this live on YouTube, be sure to hit the subscribe button. But either way, you are in for a real treat this week as we jump into tackling a handful of hyper-relevant, huge challenges that go-to-market teams are facing throughout the data center ecosystem. This includes how to improve qualified lead generation for data center and colocation services. So if your company does anything related to providing outsourced data center services or colocation, for sure, you're going to love question number one. Second, we will look at how to be seen as structured cabling trusted advisors. Then we'll turn our attention to how to get more sales for cloud services and IT infrastructure, in particular, virtual services and DRaaS, DR as a service, disaster recovery as a service. After that, we'll take a quick break for a message from our sponsor, and then we'll turn our attention to how to generate leads for wireless connectivity, private 5G networks, and managed cloud services. How a data center services and managed services provider, MSP, can generate quality leads. And as we head down the home stretch on this week's Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A show, we'll look at how a high-density data center infrastructure provider can get exposure to financial trading firms. So let's jump into the first question for this week. How can you improve qualified lead generation for data center and colocation services? How to improve qualified lead gen for data center and colocation services. So the first question that I want to know is, do all of your customers, all of your clients purchase all of your services? Or are there separate data center related services that you may provide to enterprise data centers? Or when you say data center and colocation, are you meaning largely one and the same thing? Essentially, clients renting out space in your facility to put their servers, to get access to your square footage, your power, your cooling, and telecommunications from telecommunication circuits that are coming into your facilities from a variety of carriers. So if they're all the same kinds of clients, in order to improve qualified lead generation, we first need to know where you're typically most successful. And the way we're going to do that is we're going to look at your logos. We're going to look at your case studies page and try to figure out what your happiest clients have in common. Where do they tend to be located? And the co-location presents some interesting challenges and opportunities when it comes to defining the geographic part of your ideal client profile. Why is it so interesting? Because as a single location, even as a single location co-location operator, it is entirely possible that you have a mix of clients that are both located in extreme close proximity to where you are, because they love the idea of being able to hop in their car and get there in a few minutes or 30 minutes or 60 minutes or whatever it is. And then you also can potentially have clients from literally the other side of the planet that have no presence in your area, but need to have presence in their area because of latency requirements, regulatory requirements, some other kind of solution partner client requirement, technology requirement on their side. So when it comes to what's qualified and what's not, it can be very challenging for a resource-constrained data center provider or co-location provider to get the geographic part of their ideal client profile nailed down. Because in reality, it's almost like you need two different go-to-market playbooks. If you happen to be a single co-location provider, or you're a regional co-location provider with a handful of locations, or even a national co-location provider, many sales teams, many marketing teams tend to run a hyper-local playbook, meaning that they're doing a ton of local events in their community. Every time there's technology association meetups, managed service provider meetups, anything related to entrepreneurship, technology, what have you, telecommunications, AI, they're all in. They're exhibiting, they're speaking, they're sponsoring. In many cases, they're also hosting their own events. They're hosting events where they're bringing people in to tour their facility. They're hosting user group meetings. They're hosting meetups. They're having food truck events in their parking lot tied to tours. They're hosting concert series in their local community. They're hosting fitness fairs. These are all pretty common things that you see a ton of co-location providers on a global basis getting involved in for hyper-local marketing. In addition to that, most are at least relatively realistic that they need to have a digital presence, because they know that an overwhelming majority of their clients are now heavily influenced by a digital buyer's journey. In other words, we now live in this world where a typical B2B buyer gets like 80 to 90% of the way through their research and decision making before they want to talk with someone from your sales team. It wasn't always that way. It wasn't so self-driven, wasn't always so self-service. 10 years ago, you would see prospects for colo talking to your sales team when they were like halfway through the buyer's journey, 56% at that point. Now it's like 83%. And that has massive implications, because we can't just wait for them to show up at the end and hope for the best. Because if we do that, there's a really excellent chance that your prospects and clients are learning from someone else. And the someone else's that are doing all the education and the trust building are in a massively powerful position to influence the purchase criteria that they use to evaluate all of the different data center and co-location related services that are in front of them. So if you and your team are the ones that can show up early and often for the right people in the right places at the right time, and most of all, in the right context, so you can get out of the vendor box and your team is seen as the go-to experts about anything and everything having to do with co-location in your local markets, that's fantastic. But for many companies, this is a big cultural change to take your account executives and take your sales development reps and kind of reposition, repackage, represent them to be seen more as co-location advisors, co-location consultants. And it should feel to your prospects a lot more like they're talking to like a big four consultant. It should be the business advice that they're providing should be so over the top in terms of value that your prospects and clients actually want to spend time with members of your team. And the way I've seen this manifested out there in the field with a number of the largest colocation and data center providers is their sales leaders are now so technical that one, their home labs that they do on nights and weekends when they're playing with their own equipment, it almost sounds like you're talking to someone who could be a fractional CTO to small and medium-sized businesses as their nights and weekend side hustle. That's how high the knowledge is, because there really is no reason for prospects and clients when it comes to something as commoditized as colocation to feel like they have to talk with a salesperson anymore till the absolute tail end, because they can get so much information from websites, from social media, from watching YouTube videos, from listening to podcasts, from attending webinars and live streams, from watching going to review websites, from asking their peers questions in various communities, either at community events or community discussion forums or all of the above. But it's never been harder for a salesperson to be able to get in the early and the middle of the sales cycle, unless they embrace the idea that they need to represent themselves to be seen more as a teacher, as a professor, as a trusted advisor, as a consultant, as a subject matter expert. And in some cases, the most senior members on your team may be able to successfully pull off being a thought leader. The junior members on your team, like your SDRs, your sales development reps, business development reps, who get involved early in the journey, especially if they're relatively new to the industry, well, they can still be great tour guides. They can still be a great concierge that points people in the direction of your export resources. But make no mistake, the education and trust building is the differentiation for the awareness and the consideration stages. And most of the differentiation that you think you have is only going to be relevant in the last 17% of the buyer's journey. And if you're asleep at the wheel and you're not present in that first 83%, there's a really, really strong chance that you're leaving yourself vulnerable to competitive forces that are able to get in early and are shaping the criteria that your prospects and clients use to make their major decisions. So that's the geographic part of the ideal client profile. The second is the company size part. And again, we're talking about qualified lead generation. So the first cousin of qualified lead generation is documenting your ideal client profile. So we talked about geography. Next, I want to spend a few moments to talk about company size. This is not your company size. This is your prospects. This is your client's company size. And in co-location, all too often, we're programmed to think about square footage, square meters, kilowatts, megawatts. And while that's kind of sort of relevant, it's really difficult to do outbound targeting or run ads or anything related to lead qualification based purely on space and power. You could ask those questions a little later on, but earlier on, when it comes to your targeting with your outbound, when it comes to targeting potentially with ads using something like LinkedIn, which we know is going to be, in most cases, the most productive CRM or database you can possibly have for getting access to internal champions that are interested in infrastructure as a service and technology and managed services and private cloud and co-location, all the things that a typical data center and colo operator would either be in or contemplate being in terms of lines of business. But at some point, you'll want to normalize your prospects and clients' company size based on number of employees and or headcounts. Because that's what LinkedIn does. So when you go do your searches in regular free LinkedIn or Sales Navigator or LinkedIn Campaign Manager, they all use the same bands. They all use the same ranges of employees. So based on looking at where you've been most successful, where your clients have been most successful, what kind of clients have been most profitable, where your company leadership wants to see the growth of your client list, you should be able to back into a range, company size-wise, that's a really good fit for your profile. For many companies, this is largely just about getting rid of the extreme ends of the range. Like, in other words, is a company with 1 to 10 employees going to be able to hit your minimums in most cases? I don't know. Only you can answer that based on your minimums. Does the company need to have at least 11 employees or at least 50 employees to hit your minimum level of engagement, to hit your minimum deal size for co-location and data center services? At the other extreme, is there a certain huge enterprise that's simply too big for your facility where you'd be knocked out of consideration? Now, granted, if you work for like NTT or Equinix or Digital Realty, obviously there's no upper limit for a client that could be a fit for your data center, for your colocation kind of services. But if you have a small colocation facility or relatively small colocation company with a couple of locations, there may be a point where you literally hit a wall, where it's nearly impossible for you to keep a client happy that has 10,000 plus employees or 5,000 plus employees or 1,000 plus employees, just simply because the sales cycle is way too long. The payment terms are really too hard for you to float. Your company doesn't have the kind of feature set that they're looking for. But for sure, I want you to give serious thought not only to the geographic part of what's qualified, but the company size of what's qualified. The third thing I want you to think about when it comes to your ideal client profile and what's qualified versus not qualified is your clients, your prospects' business model, the industry that they're located in. Why is this especially important? Because when it comes to providing outsourced data center services, when it comes to providing co-location, in many geographic regions, when you overlay a industry, when you overlay a business model, when you overlay a vertical on top of what it is that you do, there are certain clients that could be a great fit, and there are certain clients that could be a terrible fit just because you don't have those compliance requirements. You're not able to check off those boxes, and it would be nearly impossible for you to be able to market, sell, and service that client kind of productively. So when it comes to your ideal client profile, when it comes to what's determined to be qualified versus not qualified, get really, really clear on their geographic location, their company size by number of employees, and their industry where they're located in. And the more specific you have that plan in place to be, the easier it is for your sales leader, the easier it is for your marketing team, whoever is doing this, to build out a target account list of a defined list of anywhere from a few dozen to a few hundred, or perhaps even a few thousand companies that fit perfectly within that definition of qualified. They're in the right geographic region, they're the right company size in terms of number of employees, and they're in the right kind of industry that lines up really well with where you've been most successful, where you've been most profitable, where they've been happiest in the past. So when it comes to improving your qualified lead gen for data center and colocation services, it's critical that you have that nailed down. The second part of that is understanding who the stakeholders are within those companies that you need to be building relationships with, that you need to educate and build trust with. Those are your buyer personas. And depending on the company size, there may be different kinds of stakeholders that get involved in a co-location purchase decision. It depends on the average deal size. It depends on their size. There's a lot of contextual stuff that comes into play. This is why it's so important to be really specific about what's qualified before you even think about the kinds of people that you need to be educating and building trust with, creating awareness with in these kinds of accounts. The most important kind of stakeholder, you're going to call the primary buyer persona. In most cases, you might think of that person as the decision maker. The second most important kind of stakeholder that you need to be building relationships within those companies for data center and colocation services, that would be your secondary buyer persona. The second most important kind of person that's likely to show up on the decision committee. Let's be realistic enough to acknowledge that it's not a decision maker anymore. It's multiple decision makers sitting on a decision committee. And in some cases, depending on their company size, there may be a third category of decision maker, or third category of stakeholder who may influence the purchase. For colocation, it could be a CFO. It could be a COO. It could be a compliance manager. There could be a host of different things. It could be a general counsel. There's a lot of different things that can come into play that determines when you really figure out the different kinds of stakeholders that were involved that are sitting in your CRM records for your last 10 or 20 deals that you've closed most successfully, where they've been happiest. So that defines your buyer persona. Then starting with the most important to the least important, you're going to go study 5, 10, 20 representative people in each of those groups and figure out what their biggest goals are, what their biggest challenges are, based on actual research, not just guessing. You can do a little bit of internal research from your own internal team members, but that should maybe be 20, 25% of the input. Most of the actual input should come from either face-to-face interviews or Zoom interviews or surveys, or at the minimum, looking at a stack of LinkedIn profiles and the search footprints that come back from those same people when you go and you look them up to see really what makes them tick. But we need to get consensus on their biggest goals and challenges, because that's going to inform our content strategy. That's going to inform your product marketing. That's going to inform your sales enablement, your subject lines, your headlines, and for sure, that's going to impact your events strategy. It's shocking to me how many data center operators make these massive investments in conferences and field marketing without making sure that there's a strong match between the buyer personas in your ideal client profile and the buyer personas and demographics of who attended that conference last year and who's anticipated to be attending that conference this year. Because if you find that you're looking for a needle in a haystack, good luck getting return on investment on the conference. So it's super important to be dialed into who that ideal client profile is, who the stakeholders are within there, because that's going to, and what they care about, because that's going to have an enormous impact on what you prioritize in all your messaging and your content resources and your events, whether it's paid media, owned media, which I'm heavily partial to, or earned media. Focus on what they care about and delivering value to them. So these are some of the most important factors that you should be thinking about if you want to improve qualified lead generation for data center and colocation services. How can you be seen? How do you become a trusted advisor for structured cabling? I think a lot of it comes down to being really specific about the kinds of companies where you can be successful with structured cabling for them and who the stakeholders are within those companies that care most about structured cabling. So, as you've likely heard me talk about before, we need to know where your company has been most successful. If your company is brand new, if you're a startup and you don't have a client list, then you need to have a guess, a best guess, a hypothesis of the kinds of clients that you want if you haven't successfully built a book of business among existing structured cabling clients. And where that initial guess usually comes from is because the founder, the entrepreneur, was involved in selling and providing structured cabling support in their previous job. So that helps to inform a lot of what you're going to do initially with the targeting in terms of where the clients are located, your geographic coverage, how big or small those clients are, what industries they might be located in. And then typically your company size that you're targeting dictates a lot of who the most important stakeholders are that you need to generate and nurture leads with, build awareness and educate and build trust with. So if you're selling to a Fortune 1000 company, it's very different kinds of stakeholders for structured cabling than if you're selling to a 50-person manufacturing company or a 10-person colocation facility, owner of a colocation facility, or something like that. So all of that will involve contextualizing who you actually want to see you as, who you need to be seen as a trusted advisor with. So dial in your ideal client profile, dial in your buyer personas, and the research that you do when you're completing your buyer personas will help to figure out the topics that are top of mind, the biggest things that can get someone a huge promotion if they get right with a structured cabling initiative, and the biggest thing that are stressing people out when it comes to their structured cabling, that are driving them nuts, that are causing them to miss out on vacation time, annoying their family members when their vacation turns into a non-vacation because they're constantly getting nagged because something with the structured cabling keeps failing. Once you know all of that, it's much easier to come up with an educational content strategy, an educational event strategy that allows you to get in with the right people at the right time, in the right places, and most of all in the right context. So instead of being seen as a structured cabling vendor, you're seen as a structured cabling expert, a structured cabling consultant, a structured cabling teacher, a structured cabling trusted advisor. I'm especially partial to leaning in really, really heavily into educational content because in the self-propelled, self-driven buyer's journey that we now live in, it really is the foot in the door for most people in a sales context or a vendor context to turn the tables around on the prospect and be seen as someone that your prospect actually wants to spend time with, as opposed to you having to chase prospects and potential clients all the time. So what I would do if I was trying to become a trusted advisor for structured cabling, I would put on these amazingly impactful educational events on a regular basis. If you're working just in one particular local community where most of your prospects and clients are located within a 30 or 60-minute drive, for sure, make sure some of these events take place offline. I would try to make sure that a portion of these events are events that you totally host yourself. Meaning, in other words, if you have a great facility that you can bring people into with a small training classroom or even a conference room or a foyer, as long as it hosts a couple dozen people and you have a great list sitting in your CRM or have a target account list, by all means, it's not terribly expensive or complicated to host small targeted educational events for specific segments in your local community. You just need to get really specific about who you want to invite and figure out what's in it for them. Nobody wants to attend an infomercial. They want to attend something that adds value to their career. So it could be structured cabling 101 for fill in the blank job title and fill in the blank industry. It could be a networking event that you're hosting in your facility for IT professionals or network administrators or managed service providers or something like that in your local community where there's an education component and a networking component. You can tie it to a cocktail party, a lunch and learn, a breakfast seminar, a half a day symposia. And this is assuming that you run your own local events. In addition to that, you'll almost certainly, as you're developing your slides, as you're developing your content for that, see some opportunities to take that on the road. The first opportunity to take it on the road is to potentially jointly sponsor those local events with a non-competing entity in your local area. It could be a distributor that you partner with. It could be a data center provider. It could be a cybersecurity company. It could be a telecommunications provider. It's something where there's some significant overlap in your target prospect and target client lists, but you don't really compete head to head with each other. So there's a lot to be said for commingling and spreading the work and spreading the risk and everything with having local events. They invite their list, you invite your list, and a lot of great things can happen when you split up the work and split up the opportunities with that. A big tip that I'd recommend is try to avoid hosting those kind of events where there's a direct conflict of interest, because if you don't trust each other, it's a non-starter before it ever gets going. And I'm also very partial to doing those kind of co-marketing initiatives with companies that are similar in size to your company size. In other words, it's a lot more difficult to be on equal footing if you have a 10-person structured cabling company with 1,000-person or 10,000-person Fortune 1000 enterprise. You end up with like a David Goliath kind of scenario. So it's much, much easier if you can find like-minded founders, like-minded sales leaders in similar size companies in your region to partner with these on. The second part of that, in addition to events where you're largely controlling the invite list and the content and you don't have to share attention with a lot of different exhibitors and speakers, the alternative would be looking for local events in your area where we can try to get on the speaking agenda and or having a booth at that event. In your local community, there's an excellent chance that if you dig a little deeper into the kind of events where your buyer personas attend or have peers that attend on a regular basis, you'll probably discover that there's some annual conferences, some local meetups, some industry related events. Dig a little deeper and look at where there's opportunities to potentially show up as an expert that gives a talk on the state of structured cabling or the state of network infrastructure or the state of network connectivity, whatever it is that directly or indirectly impacts what you're trying to do with getting yourself positioned as a trusted advisor around structured cabling. Obviously, you can do this virtually as well. The same list that you're targeting for local events, live Q&A shows, weekly live streams, interviews with local experts, local webinars. So you have your offline events and you have your online events. Obviously, the advantage with the online events is your guests don't have to drive anywhere. Your costs go down to very close to zero. The downside is you don't have the same kind of know, like, and trust that you can get with an offline event, but you can reach a much larger pool of people. And if you're trying to reach people in a big regional area or national area or global area, it's obviously way, way, way more practical for someone that lives hundreds of miles away from where you're located to hop on a webinar on a regular basis than it is to travel to your location unless you're going to do a roadshow, which is another option. So there's a lot of different ways to be seen as a structured cabling trusted advisor. We talked through events. Kind of the first cousin of events would be podcasting. This is where you potentially have a weekly show or a bi-weekly show or something like that, where you're sharing tips and advice on structured cabling. You could potentially make it also an interview-based show where either all of the time or some of the time you're bringing non-competing, complementary, other trusted advisors, consultants, experts, perhaps even prospects or clients onto the show and talking about what's top of mind for them, what's relevant in terms of best practices, how they got involved in IT, how they got involved in structured cabling, advice for people that are new to structured cabling careers, advice to veteran structured cabling professionals. What does the future of structured cabling look 5 or 10 years out from now? The podcast can be enormously powerful for both recording live, for repurposing full length segments, blog posts, shorts, powering all of your social media, powering all of your email. And you also could potentially roll those into a book, another way to be seen as a structured cabling trusted advisor. But at the end of the day, this is all about priorities. It's about figuring out what you want to be known for, how deep you plan to plant your flag in the ground, how big of a flag you want to be planting in the ground, who you want to build this positioning up with in terms of being the trusted advisor for structured cabling, how strategic it is to your company, and getting really specific. What I'd also would caution you on is making sure when you're investing and being seen as a trusted advisor that you're willing to play a long game. In other words, you're not going to flip a switch and 2 weeks later be seen as a trusted advisor. It just doesn't work that way. The consistency of continuing to show up and add value over an extended period of time is what leads to you being seen as a trusted advisor. And all too often what ends up happening with some of these kinds of initiatives is when there's purely a revenue motivation and someone is hovering over trying to micromanage the whole process, where, okay, you have an interview-based podcast and you're treating your interview-based podcast guests as prospects who need to be aggressively followed up with. They're not stupid. They're going to figure out that they were manipulated and bait and switched, and they really weren't being interviewed as experts. They were being put through your sales process. So be really, really careful to make sure that you understand what it means to be a trusted advisor, and that you're willing to plant the seeds long term. You're willing to educate and build trust long term, and you're not just thinking in terms of a transaction. Because nobody wants to buy structured cabling from a car salesperson. Nobody wants to buy structured cabling today the way they did 10, 20, 30 years ago. For you to earn your way in, that allows you to be seen as a thought leader and a trusted advisor, by very definition, you need to stand out from the crowd and be willing to do things that others aren't, be able to add value over an extended period of time in a way that others simply are not. And it starts with getting super specific about who your ideal clients are, who the buyer personas are that you're most trying to influence, and delivering insane amounts of value that helps them with their jobs, their teams do better, their companies do better, so that you're seen as the definitive expert on anything and everything having to do with structured cabling. How do we get more sales for cloud services and IT infrastructure, especially virtual servers and DR as a service, disaster recovery as a service? So how do we get more sales for cloud services and IT infrastructure, especially virtual servers and DRaaS, disaster recovery as a service? Largely the first question is, are all of your clients that buy cloud services from you also IT infrastructure clients, or are they two different kinds of clients? If it's two different kinds of clients, you potentially need two different go-to-market playbooks, two different sales and marketing strategies, and potentially would want to specialize your account executives, your account managers in one of those two lines of business. If you found historically that most of your clients that buy cloud services also buy IT infrastructure from your company, virtual servers and DR as a service, then you're basically talking about a single kind of account executive that sells at the account level. And then eventually it would be account managers post-purchase that introduce your newly onboarded clients into what else you can do with them. And that's where you get into potential expansion revenue, cross sells, upsells, customer marketing to increase your share of wallet. And there's a lot of companies in the cloud services space and colocation and operators who, at least on the SMB side, the small, medium sized business side, have realized that a lot of these services have become so commoditized that they've invested in creating self-service sign up and self-service onboarding experiences so that your sales team, so that your account managers are typically only getting involved post-purchase when there's an opportunity to make sure that they're getting enough value and introducing them to other IT infrastructure related services that you do. But first and foremost, is this homogenous, a single kind of client, or is this potentially two different kinds of clients? In terms of getting more sales, it's largely the same playbook that you'd use throughout the full data center ecosystem. It's about getting hyper specific about who these ideal clients are, documenting your ideal client profile, where are your typical clients located that you want to be marketing to. Are they in just a certain geographic region? Can you sell nationally? Can you sell to multiple countries? Can you sell to an entire continent? Can you sell globally? And where do you do best? Because it's entirely possible that someone on the other side of the planet could sign up for your services, but that may not be the sweet spot for who gets the most value from your company. That may not be where there's strong consensus among your case studies, the most profitable, the most strategic area of growth where your company leadership wants to see you be growing your sales and scaling up your sales in the coming months and in the coming years. So get really specific about where they're located. Second, what company size are they? The reason that this is important to get really specific on their number of employees, their headcount, is when it comes to whether it's using outbound, using a database like LinkedIn Sales Navigator or something similar, that's going to run on number of employees or revenue. When it comes to using like ads, if like, for example, if your marketing team was running LinkedIn ads through LinkedIn Campaign Manager, that also runs on number of employees. The whole filtering system on LinkedIn, the world's largest professional network with 1 billion members, where arguably any internal champion for anything related to IT infrastructure technology is going to be somewhat, at least somewhat active to very, very active on the LinkedIn platform on a regular basis. Like a lot of how LinkedIn slices, dices, and segments its members and filters those is the same kind of methodology that you should be using when it comes to getting more sales and building a sales and marketing go-to-market playbook for your cloud services and IT infrastructure. So know geographically who you're looking to target, know the company size. What's the minimum number of employees that a company needs to have to afford your minimums, to hit your minimum commitment to work with your company? What's so large that it's really very unlikely that they're going to be happy with your company? So that allows you to do what I call Goldilocks, not too hot, not too cold, not too big, not too small. So what's that range? Do you end up excluding companies with 1 to 10 employees or 1 to 50 employees on the low end? Do you end up excluding companies with 10,000 employees or more, or 1,000 employees or more? So you might end up with, okay, our ideal client profile is in this particular country, and we're looking for companies with anywhere from 50 to 1,000 employees or something like that for our cloud services and IT infrastructure. Obviously, your results will vary. Your target market will certainly vary, but that's just one example of how it might be defined. And then at the intersection of cloud services and IT infrastructure, especially in your geographic region, there are sometimes business models, industries, vertical markets that can either make you well qualified or immediately disqualify you based on compliance requirements. Like, for example, with financial services, with healthcare, with education, with government, there's various kinds of accreditations and certifications that your company would need to have in order to be able to successfully sell and service cloud and IT infrastructure in those kinds of companies. So depending on where you're located, you may also want to specifically include or specifically exclude certain kinds of industries, certain kind of business models or vertical markets. And again, this is something where LinkedIn has your back. When it comes to Sales Navigator, when it comes to LinkedIn Campaign Manager, you can certainly include and exclude based on geographic regions, based on number of employees, and based on certain industries. So To get more sales, now we're super specific at the company level. From there, you should be able to build out a target account list of anywhere from a couple dozen to a couple hundred to maybe a couple thousand companies that fit within that ideal client profile. That'll inform what you're doing with defining your addressable market and your sales territories and everything else that's directly related to that. And then within those kinds of accounts, who are the people that we need to improve our awareness with, that we need to educate and build trust with? Those people we're going to define as buyer personas. A buyer persona is a semi-fictional representation of an ideal client based on actual research and some select educated speculation. The select educated speculation, no more than 20% of what goes into a buyer persona. That's where it's okay for you to talk with longtime members of your company, longtime members of your industry who have some hunches based on muscle memory of what they think the buyer personas care about. But their hunches should be no more than 20-25% of your buyer persona research. The overwhelming majority of your buyer persona research needs to come from actual interviews with actual people that are representative of those buyer personas, face-to-face interviews, Zoom interviews. But if you can't get access to that, surveys, looking up their exact words of what shows up in your CRM, looking at a stack of LinkedIn profiles to see how they self-describe themselves, how they self-describe their companies, the kind of content they share, the kind of ecosystems they belong to. Essentially, for your primary and your secondary, your first and your second most important kind of buyers, we need to get really strong consensus on what is top of mind for them, what they care about, what their biggest goals are, and what their biggest challenges are. And we need to get that in their own words, not what we think those words might be, but what those words actually are. Because the difference between getting that right versus totally right, or getting it right versus wrong, is the difference between your headline and your ad and your subject line and pretty much everything. How you name your products, what's in your proposals, is going to be the difference between whether you succeed or whether you do not succeed, whether you resonate or whether you completely fall flat and are ignored. So from that buyer persona research, you'll be able to back into a content strategy. You'll be able to back into an educational event strategy that fuels everything that you do going forward, with webinars, offline webinars like educational events, hosting your own breakfast seminars, lunch and learn symposia, speaking at other people's events, but getting really tight on your buyer personas and your ideal client profiles and what those stakeholders, who the most important stakeholders are and what they care about, is the key to really cutting through all the noise and getting more sales for cloud services and IT infrastructure. The second part of that is we need to recognize that your buyers today research and compare options and make their purchase decisions very differently than they did 10 years ago. 10 years ago, your prospects and clients spent about half of their buyer's journey, half of the sales cycle, with your sales team. At the time, the number was like 56% over before sales contact. So there was still 44% of the buyer's journey left for your prospects to spend with your sales team. Fast forward ahead 10 years, including a couple of years of tens of millions of people working from home at the beginning of the 2020s. Fast forward in some significant retirement among baby boomers and more Gen Z and millennials, and certainly Gen X being in decision-making roles, and just progress on digital transformation. And we're now in this world where the self-guided buyer's journey, the self-directed self-research, is now the predominant buyer's journey. So much to the point that 83% of researching, comparing options, and evaluating pricing now happens before sales contact. So you need a creative way, a proactive way to get your team in early and often with the right people in the right places at the right time, and most of all in the right context. Because if you get in early and often and have a role in many of those 28 touch points between complete stranger and purchase decision, you are in a massively powerful, impactful place to be able to shape the criteria that your prospects and clients use to evaluate other cloud services and IT infrastructure options. Conversely, if you're asleep at the wheel and you only meet prospects at the absolute end of their buyer's journey, what that means is someone else has had a dramatic impact on how your prospects and clients compare their available options for cloud services and IT infrastructure. And if you're only found at the end, you're unfortunately in that demoralizing race to the bottom with price competition only. You're not going to have much of an opportunity for differentiation because you're already treading water. In order to get meaningful differentiation, your account executives, your sales development, your marketers, they need to show up more like teachers and consultants and trusted advisors and subject matter experts rather than just a vendor who's trying to pitch cloud services and IT infrastructure. At the end of the day, it's like having a reason for someone to become a known lead to your company, to basically trade a little bit of their personal information for what's on the other side of that landing page registration form. And once they're a lead, trying to add as much value to them in as many of those 28 touch points as possible throughout their buyer's journey. Because if you're really tight on who those buyer personas are and you have enough muscle memory, pattern recognition about what comes, not only about the question they're asking you now, what comes at step 2, 3, 4, 5, all the way through to step 28, you can not only proactively give them the resources that they need at the right time, but you can also have massive sales cycle acceleration. So this is better customer insight research, better segmentation, better personalization, email that adds a ton of value, video content, live events, live webinars, live in-person events, live virtual events, on-demand events, supporting the full decision committee. That's the other thing too, where a lot of people get really messed up. They think there's just a single decision maker on any kind of significant purchase around cloud services and IT infrastructure. There's no longer just one decision maker. It's a decision committee. That's why it's so incredibly important for you to understand who those buyer personas are and have a proactive strategy for getting multiple people in this company to fall in love with your content and your education, and by extension, fall in love with your brand, which ensures that your company not only stays on the short list throughout the full buyer's journey, but in many cases eliminates most of the other options that are on the short list for competitive alternatives. So those are some of the things that I would be thinking about when it comes to how to get more sales for cloud services and IT infrastructure, especially virtual servers and DR, disaster recovery as a service. The Data Center Go-to-Market podcast is sponsored by DCSMI, elevating the role of sales, marketing, and go-to-market GTM professionals in the growth of the data center industry. To stay informed about upcoming episodes, make sure that you subscribe to the Data Center Sales and Marketing newsletter on the DCSMI website that can be found at www.dcsmi.com. Again, that URL is www.dcsmi.com. Hey, Joshua Feinberg here from DCSMI, the Data Center Sales and Marketing Institute, and you are watching the Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A live stream, where each week I tackle a handful of the biggest sales and marketing challenges that we're hearing about from all over the data center ecosystem. Next question up is, how do we generate leads for wireless connectivity, private 5G networks, and managed cloud services? So what goes into successful lead generation for wireless connectivity, private 5G networks, and managed cloud services? So the first question up is, are we potentially talking about 3 different lines of business that each need their own go-to-market strategy, that each need their own sales and marketing playbook, and potentially different account executives, different account managers? Or is it very likely that one kind of client buys more than one of these services, buyers wireless connectivity and private 5G and managed cloud services? And our goal is to just get them signed up for something, and then the account managers and upsell and cross-sell opportunities and customer marketing takes over. And the only way we're going to know the answer to that question is to look at your logos and where you've been most successful in the past. Look at your case studies, look in your CRM, and try to figure out, both initially and on an ongoing basis, are you seeing most of your clients buy all of these services or just buy one? So that's going to drive a lot of your segmentation strategy, not only for the who we help kind of pages on your website or the solutions that are on your website, and then what you do with everything with traffic and lead generation, nurturing, segmentation, sales cycle acceleration, everything with growing a successful company in and around wireless connectivity, private 5G, and managed cloud. So as long as they're one kind of client, that actually simplifies things quite a bit, because then you can have one unified go-to-market team, marketers, sales development, potentially account executives, account managers, one product person, one channel partnerships kind of person or one channel partnerships team. Obviously, these all should be able to scale to multiple people, but it doesn't require that you kind of segregate these and almost treat them as separate businesses. So when it comes to lead generation for these kinds of companies, where have we been most successful in the past? Where are they located? Obviously, when it comes to both wireless and private 5G, there will for sure be some geographic guardrails. With managed cloud services, there may not be geographic guardrails, but when it comes to the location of what networks you can white label and put subscribers onto, yeah, it's a function of where the towers are. So with that in mind, that will play heavily into the geographic portion of your ideal client profile. In terms of number of employees, their company size, a lot of it will depend on your company size, your product and services menu, and what your minimums look like on the low end, at least. In other words, like if you want clients to be spending $10,000 a month or 10,000 euros or pounds or whatever your local currency equivalent is, you more than likely are not going to have the bar be set at a 1 to 10 person company, maybe not even an 11 to 50 person company. So your minimum size, your minimum deal size, your minimum requirements, whether you're operating as a business or enterprise provider or whether you're selling on the consumer side, will dictate how you approach identifying what's qualified versus non-qualified on the low end, on the minimum side. On the maximum side, there's another interesting kind of question. Can your company realistically sell wireless connectivity, private 5G network access, and managed cloud services to huge enterprise companies with 10,000 plus employees or 1,000 plus employees? Or are you most successful more in large, small businesses in the mid-market? Maybe it's companies with anywhere from 50 to 500 employees or 50 to 1,000 employees. And again, only you can answer that question, but I need you to be able to answer that question and document that, because that's going to have a massive impact on your go-to-market strategy, your ideal client profile, what's considered qualified versus not qualified, who you target with your outbound motions, who you potentially target with ads, what kind of information you're looking to gather on your website lead gen forms, what goes into your sales process that your SDRs, BDRs, AEs, whatever go through, and determining who's qualified and not qualified. The third place potentially that could be less of an issue on the wireless connectivity side and private 5G, but certainly is a huge issue on the managed cloud services side, is industry. The reality, though, is for a lot of industries, all of your services, there could be industry relevance. Like, for example, if you want to sell to healthcare clients, if you want to be able to sell to financial services clients, if you want to be able to sell to education or government, depending on where you're located, there could be some pretty stringent compliance requirements that you need to be able to meet across your multiple lines of business. So that will also factor into what industries potentially are included versus excluded from your total addressable market, from your ideal client profile. So with all of that in mind, once we've nailed our ideal client profile, you should be able to build a target account list of anywhere from a couple dozen to a few hundred, and in some cases a few thousand companies that would be a great fit to be future clients of your company. And from there, you can set about identifying and prioritizing your most important buyer personas, potentially your primary and secondary buyer persona that have the most influence, that are the most impactful stakeholders on the decision committee when various prospects are evaluating what they want to do with their wireless connectivity, their private 5G networks, and their managed cloud services. So once you've identified and prioritized who the most important personas are, then we actually need to do the research and figure out what they care most about at the intersection of wireless connectivity, private 5G networks, and managed cloud services, what they care most about, what their biggest goals are, what their biggest challenges are, and their biggest goals that they're trying to achieve personally, as a team, as a company, as well as the biggest stressors that they face in their job when it comes to wireless connectivity, private 5G, and managed cloud. All of that will get rolled into your positioning. All of that will get rolled into your product marketing, into your sales enablement content, into your educational content strategy, into your educational event strategy. And all of that will have a massive impact in what you do with your lead generation and sales cycle acceleration for growing your lines of business. But because at the end of the day, in order to really be relevant to these mid-market and enterprise clients that are buying these kinds of services going forward, we can't show up as someone that's just focused on the transaction anymore, because they don't need you to tell them about what the transaction looks like. Websites, review websites, YouTube videos, podcasts, webinars, asking their peers questions on social media. Those channels have all won that battle already. In order for us to earn our way in early and often in the incredibly formative stages in the early and the middle parts of the buyer's journey, where 2/3 of those 28 touch points are happening, and you're able to massively impact how they research, compare options, and evaluate other things that are in front of them when it comes to all of those categories, wireless, private 5G, and managed cloud. We need to make sure that your client-facing team is showing up as consultants and teachers and trusted advisors and subject matter experts and perhaps even thought leaders on anything and everything having to do with wireless connectivity, private 5G, and managed cloud. So to the extent that we're able to spend a ton of time with these prioritized buyer personas throughout their full buyer's journey, that surface area essentially starves attention away from competitive forces. And when this is done exceptionally well at a world-class level, you're starving that time away so badly from competitive alternatives that your company is not only guaranteed to be on the short list, but numerous competitors will drop from the short list, surely by virtue of how impactful your educational experiences have been on the first and second most important kinds of buyer personas that are consuming your content and attending and participating in your educational events. It can have a game-changing impact on generating leads for wireless connectivity, private 5G networks, and managed cloud services. The challenge is most companies are still running their playbook as if it's still 10 years ago, or worse. They're running their playbook as if the fax machine and the dial-up modem and the BlackBerry all still matters, kind of like Web 1.0, perhaps Web 2.0. They haven't caught up to this reality where the digital journey is the predominant journey. And they still think they're marketing and selling to a decision maker that probably at this point has retired. At the risk of overgeneralizing, I'm Gen X. Most of the baby boomers that I hang out with that are still working full time in this industry are just as digitally savvy as I am. They spend hours each day on LinkedIn. They watch tons of YouTube videos. They attend webinars. They're navigating the journey the same way that Gen X and millennials are. So if you're thinking that you still have much of your ICP, your ideal client profile, and buyer personas who are digitally resistant, I would check yourself. I would literally go back and look at to make sure your assumptions are still valid with your buyer personas, because for most people that are internal champions in their company, when it comes to a technology initiative around wireless connectivity, private 5G, or managed cloud, there is an excellent chance that they're among the 1 billion active users on LinkedIn, the world's leading professional network. So it's really a strategy decision, a priority decision of whether you understand just how much your buyer personas have changed and are showing up where they actually are, not where you'd like them to be, but where they actually are in a meaningful way that you can add value to as many of those 28 touch points as possible. And just a cautionary note, in case your company invests aggressively still in offline events and conferences, it doesn't matter how amazing your golf tournament was, how amazing your cocktail party was at the big conference. Each of those only counts as one touch point. So unless you're buying into this notion that that prospect is going to wait 364 days to see you again at next year's event, you need a strategy to stay in front of them early and often, with a huge emphasis on often. And you can't just have your sales team, your account executive showing up asking, are you ready to buy yet? How come you haven't bought yet? What is it going to take to get you into this managed Wi-Fi, private 5G today? That's not what they want. They want someone that feels a lot more like a consultant and a lot less like a salesperson. So it's entirely possible that there's some significant upskilling that's going to need to happen within your company for your team to be able to pull this off. But at a high level, these are C-level initiatives that need to start from the top down. Otherwise, your cultural forces of inertia are going to force you to keep driving yourself into irrelevance over time because you're no longer marketing and selling and servicing the way your ideal clients want to be marketed to and sold and serviced when it comes to wireless connectivity, private 5G, and managed clouds. So that's how I would approach lead generation for those three lines of business wrapped up into one single kind of ideal client. How does a data center services and managed services provider, an MSP, generate quality leads? How does a data center services and managed services provider, an MSP, generate quality leads? Well, let's start by taking the qualitative part out of this because qualitative sounds really subjective to me. And we need to get past subjectivity and we need to move towards objectivity. So we have a defined, measurable way of evaluating whether a lead is actually qualified or not. And it doesn't rely on someone's personal opinion and it doesn't rely on hunches. It relies on literally being able to run include and exclude filters in LinkedIn and have drop downs on your web forms and filters in your CRMs. And it takes a lot of the gray areas out of this. So when it comes to your data center services and managed services and what is actually a qualified lead, we need to get really tight about where you've been most successful in the past. What kinds of clients have been most successful with your data center services and with your managed services in the past? And can we get into a place where we're really, really tight about where those clients are located? Are they just located in your local region? Is proximity important? Can they be located anywhere within your country? Can they be located anywhere within several different countries within a continent? Or can they be located anywhere on the planet? That's your business model to figure out. But as long as you have an established business, more than likely your logos and your case studies will give you some significant clues. Your CRM history with your closed won clients of the clients you want more of will give you significant clues with that. So we need to know geographically what's qualified. We also need to know size-wise what's qualified. Because for most companies that are buying outsourced data center services, and especially outsourced managed services, they tend to skew on the smaller side because they don't have a huge bench of IT talent internally. But there's probably a minimum level at which they need to be doing with your company for them to be worthwhile as a client in the first place. So LinkedIn gives you some really interesting targeting filtering parameters that you can use around number of employees. So what I would encourage you to do is as you're documenting your ideal client profile for your data center services and managed services is to think about what company size is too small and what company size is too big. Too small probably means they can't afford you. So maybe it's 1 to 10 employees, maybe it's 1 to 50 employees. Again, only you can answer that question. And what's too big, where it's likely that they're going to be looking for wholesale data center kind of providers or a completely different level of enterprise managed services that your company may not be able to provide unless you're a huge company yourself. So be self-aware about where you've been successful and where you haven't been in the past. And that will more than likely help you get a much tighter definition of what a quality lead looks like or what a qualified lead looks like based on number of employees, based on headcount. For a lot of companies that sell outsourced data center services or managed services, it may be anywhere from like 50 employees to 500 employees or 50 to 1,000 employees. Again, what's too small to afford you and what's so large that they're going to be looking to have a very different level of sophistication than your company may be able to provide. And then there's almost certainly also a industry specific factor on who's qualified and who's not because of your compliance certifications, especially within like financial services, healthcare, education, government, that kind of stuff. In some cases, even manufacturing and e-commerce, there's certain kinds of capabilities that you're going to need to have to be successful in providing data center services and managed services to those kinds of clients. So if you think about sitting down in like LinkedIn Sales Navigator or LinkedIn Campaign Manager on the ad side, there's inclusions and there's exclusions. Inclusions are like, okay, I want these countries and I want to exclude these countries. I want this company size, but I don't want that company size. I want this industry and I don't want that industry. When you get that specific about that in your ideal client profile, you'll take out a lot of the subjectivity and internal arguments that can really derail your progress with all of this. And that alone, that single one-page definition, super crisp definition of that, making sure that everyone in your company has access to it that's client facing, can solve an enormous amount of arguments and help to grow your company better and faster. That also will help to determine what actually is qualified versus non-qualified. And from there, it's a matter of figuring out the stakeholders who are in those kinds of accounts. You can build a target account list of representative companies that would be perfect to be future clients of yours based on that ideal client profile. From there, you can also define who your first and second most important kind of stakeholders are that you need to be building relationships with, your primary and secondary buyer persona. And from there, once you have that researched and documented, you can build your educational content strategy, your educational event strategy of everything that you're going to do with lead generation, segmentation, personalization, nurturing, sales cycle acceleration, everything that goes into building a revenue growth engine around outsourced data center services and outsourced managed services. But at the end of the day, first things first, we need to get really, really tight about what actually qualified is, what your ideal client profile looks like, so we get out of these subjective judgments of people using hunches and opinions, because that's not productive. It's not scalable. It just leads to a lot of arguments, a lot of friction internally, and it can lead to a crappy prospect experience and customer experience as well, which isn't good for your reputation. It isn't good for your brand. Remember, going forward, regardless of what your company does in the data center ecosystem, but especially if you're like a data center operator that provides outsourced data center services and managed services, your brand is now everything that the marketplace says about you when you're not in the room. And given that you're not in the room anymore for most of the buyer's journey, unless you figure out a way to show up early and often as a teacher or a consultant or a subject matter expert, your content, your educational events are going to do a lot of the heavy lifting for building your brand and supporting your brand that used to be done in face-to-face conversations. So it's incredibly important to get really tight about who you're doing this for and why they should care. There's an enormous amount of wasted energy and resources in this industry going to create awareness for data center providers and managed service providers who have a wishy-washy definition of who their target client is and who these buyer personas are. You can gain a significant competitive advantage by getting much tighter, much crisper, and much more empathetic about what they care about, and making sure that you're delivering a value in a way that is well received by them, because you're focusing on what they care about, not what you care about. So at the end of the day, for a data center services and managed services provider to generate more qualified leads, we need to recognize that the self-driven buyer's journey is very real. We need to recognize that the way into that, those 28 touch points, having surface area at as many as 28 touch points in the awareness and the consideration stages, is heavily dependent on having amazingly helpful educational content and educational events experiences. No one wants these services to be sold to them anymore. They want to purchase them. They want to be in the driver's seat. They're going to be in the driver's seat, because if we don't allow them to be in the driver's seat, one of your competitors is going to allow them to be in the driver's seat and better support them. So the more self-aware you are about how much the world has changed, what your personas, what your ideal clients care about, and the better job you can align your company culture and whole revenue team around that, the better off you're going to be when it comes to anything and everything about a data center services provider and managed service provider generating quality leads. That brings us to our final question as we head down the home stretch on this week's data center go-to-market sales and marketing Q&A show. But before we do that, I just want to remind you that if you want to stay up to date about new and upcoming events like this and educational resources, make sure you subscribe to our data center sales and marketing newsletter that comes every Sunday to your email inbox by going to www.dcsmi.com. So the final question that we'll be addressing this week is, how does a high density data center infrastructure provider get exposure to financial trading firms? So we need to get specific about who these financial trading firms are. Where are they located? How many employees do they have? And what else do we know about their business models? The answers to those 2 or 3 questions will help you nail your ideal client profile. Once you understand where they're located and what their size is and what their business models are, from there you should be able to build a target account list to support all of your account-based marketing and account-based selling. And depending on the nature of your business model, you may end up with anywhere from a couple dozen to a couple hundred, maybe even a couple thousand ideal clients that are financial trading firms that could be a perfect fit for your company. Then within those firms, we need to know who's going to care the most about your high density data center infrastructure services, and get super specific about who they are and what they care about. We're going to designate the most important kind of stakeholder as our primary buyer persona. We'll designate the second most important category of stakeholder as our secondary buyer persona. We're going to be self-aware enough to understand that the people at these firms no longer research and purchase data center services the way they did 10 years ago. It's now very much a self-driven buyer's journey, where as much as 80 or 90% of researching, comparing options, and decision-making is over before you even meet them. So we must show up early and often with amazingly helpful, amazingly specific educational content and educational events experiences at the intersection of financial services, financial trading, and high-density data center infrastructure. We need to recognize that our brand is no longer just what we say about ourselves, but is the total of what the marketplace says about our company at the intersection of our expertise at the highly niched intersection of financial trading and data center infrastructure services. And we need to reposition our client-facing team, our account executives, our sales development reps, our marketers, our product managers, our account managers to be seen as the definitive go-to experts in this space at the intersection of data center infrastructure that financial trading firms would care about. And then from there, it's simple outreach. We're going to have a strong educational content calendar with amazingly helpful videos and blogs and email newsletters and live streams and webinars and offline events, perhaps a book, perhaps a podcast, all of these things that makes it a no-brainer for the most important decision makers, for the most important members of that decision committee, to see our firm as the definitive experts on data center infrastructure within those companies. So if we want to get exposure to those companies, we need to show up, one, in a way where we're seen as the experts, and two, in a way that reflects how they actually research and navigate and compare their options. Because if we're able to get in early and often, we can have an amazingly powerful impact on how they set up the criteria that they use to evaluate all the different data center infrastructure options that are in front of them. If we don't get in early and often, there's an excellent chance that we're leaving ourselves really vulnerable to a competitor that's going to get in early and often and help shape that criteria that's obviously going to stack the decks in their favor. So at the end of the day, your client-facing team needs to look a lot more like consultants, data center infrastructure consultants, than traditional transaction-focused account executives and sales development reps and account managers. And the better job you can do that, the more it feels like your prospects and clients are speaking to a big four consultant, like someone that would work for EY, PwC, KPMG, or Deloitte, $1,000 an hour kind of consultant. The more you can successfully do that, the easier everything gets with your company growth. So that is how I would approach how a high density data center infrastructure provider can get exposure to financial trading firms. So that's the final question that we're going to be able to address in this week's Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A live stream. I'm Joshua Feinberg from DCSMI, the Data Center Sales and Marketing Institute. We're all about elevating the role of sales, marketing, and go-to-market professionals in the growth of the data center industry. Make sure you follow us on LinkedIn, subscribe to our YouTube channel, and make sure that you get our weekly email newsletter delivered directly to your email inbox on Sundays by subscribing at www.dcsmi.com. And until next week, I wish you great success in growing your data center related career, your team's influence, and your company's influence in the data center, digital infrastructure, critical facilities industry. Take care now and have a great week.
The Data Center Go-to-Market podcast is sponsored by DCSMI, elevating the role of sales, marketing, and go-to-market GTM professionals in the growth of the data center industry. To stay informed about upcoming episodes, make sure that you subscribe to the Data Center Sales and Marketing newsletter on the DCSMI website that can be found at www.dcsmi.com. Again, that URL is www.dcsmi.com.